Gaming, and certainly role-playing games, have not always been in a good place. And I think if we're criticising the times where things maybe are not so great, maybe periods where we're mainly getting live services, we're getting cash grabs, titles designed around microtransactions, then we should appreciate the times where things are pretty good. And I do have to say that 2023, certainly this second half of the year, there have been some great titles that have come out in a short space of time. We've certainly had Baldur's Gate 3. We've just had Starfield, and regardless of your opinions of that title, if you think that it's maybe not as good as previous Bethesda titles, you might think the procedural generation is too much, certainly valid, but I do think that it is a single-player game that isn't designed around sort of pay to win. It's something you can jump into, get immersed in, and have a pretty good time. And there have been periods where we haven't had a lot of that. You then factor in Phantom Liberty dropping today, depending on where you live in the world, and it's a pretty decent little period. So I'm appreciating that, but I also want to jump back to 2022, because Elden Ring came out. I think that when that released, it really kicked up a wave, a bit of a storm for gamers, and certainly gamers in the mainstream who might not have always gone to role-playing games and seen them as their sort of title. Dark Souls, the series was a big success, but Elden Ring took things to another level. And we know that the DLC is coming pretty soon. Shadows of the Erdtree, it's releasing potentially, according to rumours, possibly this year. I heard that floated around. I think that's pretty ridiculous. It's not going to happen. Let's be realistic. But it could actually release this fiscal year, which is at the end of March. So if that was to happen, we're looking at 6 months at the most, and I think it's worth talking about. So the rumour I mentioned, it came from Bandai Namco Europe CEO. He was asked about when the DLC was going to release, and people took his answer that they want to keep momentum going, that's their focus. They took that as meaning the DLC might release before January. Again, I think that's super unlikely. There's been no real mention of it. Elden Ring was announced pretty far in advance. FromSoftware really hyped that up. And we haven't heard a lot, so I don't think it's going to come out before January. But other people have suggested that it could release before the end of the fiscal year, which would be March 2024. If that's the case, and I hope it is, that's really only a 6-month wait if it releases at the very tail end of that period. So that's really not long. It's going to come around quickly. A lot of people who are interested in role-playing games, they're probably still going to be busy with Baldur's Gate 3, Starfield, Cyberpunk. There's some other titles coming out between then and now. But that'll keep people going. And then the Elden Ring DLC comes out, which will sort of end a really nice period, I think, of games that are at that super high quality standard. We haven't had such a run for ages, and I'm really enjoying it. It's really nice to see. There's, I suppose, so many games that come out where they are nostalgia grabs. You get excited, and then you get let down. So the fact that we started this all with Baldur's Gate 3, at least in this half of the year, it's been pretty exciting. If we go back to 2022, Elden Ring was obviously the big game, and I see Baldur's Gate 3 as being that game this year. But with Elden Ring itself, I think it sort of broke down a few barriers. A lot of people have maybe seen role-playing games as less mainstream, at least when there's not some sort of gimmick attached, or they're not super console-focused. I think role-playing games do get pushed to the wayside a little bit. Some developers haven't been as keen on them. They may be a bit more expensive to develop than other titles, at least when it doesn't have the live service element, which seems to be going away a little bit in some cases, but we'll talk about that perhaps a bit later. When Elden Ring released, it did ask people the question, what is a high-quality open-world RPG? People have been used to Skyrim, Fallout 4, the Assassin's Creed Witcher clones that were coming out around that time. And I do think that it changed standards. People were no longer going to tolerate just that really typical cluttered map that feels like an amusement park where you're chasing map markers around. It's those dopamine hits when you pick up an item. It's not really about the content and really engaging in the gameplay. Elden Ring absolutely is that. It's got a really vast, really large world, but it's about those genuine points of interest. Not every 2 meters there being something sort of pointless to pick up or engage with. It's a world you can get immersed in. It feels real. I do believe we saw that with Baldur's Gate 3 as well, where it came out, it was released by a studio known for releasing high-quality titles like FromSoftware, and then you had other developers panicking about this change standard. What FromSoftware, what Larian are releasing, it's not lining up with these design documents we've got, or what we learn in gaming school, where it's about tricking the player into enjoying themselves. No, this is about a genuine experience that people like for what it is. They don't have to be sort of tricked or psychologically manipulated by some microtransaction guru into picking up this game. People actually like it. I really hope that with Shadow of the Erdtree, the DLC coming out from Elden Ring, that it can keep this going. FromSoftware, I'd say an all-time high. They really haven't dropped off much, apart from Dark Souls 2, at least since that first Dark Souls title came out. So they're in a really, really good position to keep this going. And I see feedback online. I see that most people seem to want from Shadow of the Erdtree more of those legacy dungeons. The open world itself, it's really, really nice to explore once, but on repeat playthroughs, it can start to feel a bit samey, and you can see some of the flaws in that. Really, really excellent game, but there are some areas that I'd like to see improved. I think that's something that's quite important. A lot of people look at these games as black or white. It's either complete rubbish or it's the greatest thing ever. It's happened again with Baldur's Gate 3, and then it's happened somewhat with Starfield, where some people see Starfield as absolute dog shit because it doesn't meet certain standards, whereas I'd say that there are great things about it, it's just maybe not as good as your Elden Rings and Baldur's Gate 3. So Shadow of the Erdtree, legacy dungeons, what I mean by that is those, I suppose, the handcrafted areas where you explore them and they're a bit more like a Dark Souls area, where it's not super linear necessarily. There might be different pathways you can go, but it's not just an open field. People love those. It's interesting that those didn't really drop off in Elden Ring. There's at least as many quality areas in that game as there are in Dark Souls titles. And given Dark Souls titles are basically all that and nothing else, it is quite amazing that they're able to keep this standard in Elden Ring. More of those, they would be greatly beneficial. If they want to keep the open world going, if we're not just sort of interacting with an item and being teleported to some area which we go and explore, like maybe the Dark Souls DLCs had, if we're genuinely getting another piece of the open world to explore, I hope there maybe is a bit of a focus on how can we make this a bit more interesting and not predictable. I don't want just a bunch of those caves. They got a little bit predictable. There was some fatigue, I think, in Elden Ring players, and I don't think that most Elden Ring players actually played to the end, which is fair enough. I've accepted that most gamers are not going to play from start to finish. They're going to really cash in on the game while the hype's there, but maybe not play until the very end and explore everything. But for people who did do that, who played it all the way through, most can agree that snowy area, I can't remember the name, but that snowy area, that's where that fatigue set in, and people thought, right, I've had enough of these caves. I've had enough of this same boss for the 5th time in the 120th cave. This is getting a bit much. I want them to change it up. Where modern open world games can get a bit stale is you start doing the same thing over and over again. When you get to a new area, that wonder of what could be here, what could I find, that's kind of gone. You know, whether it's Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, oh, it's going to be another shrine, or in Elden Ring, oh, it's going to be another cave dungeon with the same layout, the same assets as I've experienced hundreds of times before. I want to see a bit more experimentation, where it isn't just 10 of the same piece of content slightly changed over and over. Let's try and be a bit more creative. I know that may not always be realistic in game development because someone's got to build this stuff and you've got to prioritize, but I want to be surprised. And if anyone's going to do that, it's going to be FromSoftware. I spoke about FromSoftware's release schedule being really positive in the last few years, and that really hit home for me with Sekiro. I played it when it came out. It was incredible. I loved that real action-orientated take on the gameplay, a little bit different to Dark Souls. I don't think they're going to make a sequel to that game, because once you really nail that combat and you feel like you've really solved it, you've basically done everything you can do. If they were to release new bosses, I think asset-wise, what you kind of see on your screen could be interesting, but the actual gameplay wouldn't be much different. You're still parrying, and once you've nailed that, you've kind of solved it all. You've seen it all. We've obviously had Armored Core 6 come out very recently. I've had a lot of fun with it. I played that as probably my first mech game, so I can't critique it in the same way others can, who have played through maybe that whole series or other titles like Mech Warrior. But for me, at least, it was something different. It was all about the gameplay. There was less on the exploration front. As I saw someone put it, the exploration is more so in the mech building, different builds, and how you're going to tackle these challenges. So that's an interesting direction. Whether that comes to the Elden Ring DLC, if maybe those teams have been communicating and there's a lot of build variety in the Elden Ring DLC, we'll have to see. If I'm honest, I'm someone who sort of picks up, chooses my items, and sticks to it. But for the people who like that build variety and love to mix it up, I'm sure FromSoftware are only going to learn from the strengths of Armored Core 6 and what people are saying there. So back to the DLC itself, if it does have one or two of those dungeons that are highly explorable, they've got good bosses in there, that to me would make most happy. I'd be pretty pleased with that. But if they can add the open world component too, which you would think is likely, it has been the strength of Elden Ring, if they're going to add some more to the map. If that can add more to do, different activities, or at least different surprises, I'd like to see them go down that road so that they can take those learnings into an Elden Ring 2. They can expand on it. They can get our feedback now and apply that feedback into a new title rather than having to try new things in 5 or 6 years' time when the next one releases. And then we sort of have to gauge that. They've got a good opportunity now to experiment. I did want to mention something else, and it's not directly related to the Elden Ring DLC, but it is related to FromSoftware. And you might have heard about Phil Spencer, head of gaming at Xbox, his emails that were getting leaked and passed around, and everyone was laughing because he was sending out these corporate messages about how, oh, Microsoft, it's ahead of Sony, it's going to dominate the whole market, this is incredible, and we haven't really seen that. Some of those emails were from years ago, and things haven't sort of gone too well for them since then. There was an email that did the rounds about Redfall and how that was going to be their next big game. That was obviously a disaster, a joke, and I feel sorry for Arcane. It's something I may make a video on later because it's quite a tragedy. But if we look at what's going on here, Phil Spencer, he's talking about Elden Ring, he's talking about FromSoftware, and he says, good options, let's work it. Another option with the hit factor around Elden Ring is to try to go get all the Dark Souls games and make a push with From and an Elden Ring upsell. Is he just talking about getting games onto Game Pass? Possibly. But I would imagine that there would have had to have been conversations about buying FromSoftware. I think if they floated talks around buying Nintendo, there's no way that FromSoftware hasn't been on the table at some point. I don't want to see it. When Game Pass first launched, it was something I took some interest in. I was interested in seeing where things were going because Phil was putting these titles on PC. And I like a world where there's more on PC because that's that sort of open platform for the most part. And I feel like if games are coming to PC, it's best for everyone, regardless of where you play. You don't want people to be able to lock lots of things down on console because then the publishers can really start to do what they want. And I'll say with Game Pass as well, I don't want a world where you can only subscribe to play a game. I want the option to buy it. It's fine for people who maybe don't have the financial means to be buying games, and Game Pass is good value, but there should always be both options there. And I very much want to make sure that FromSoftware, those games are available to everyone. I don't know what Microsoft would do long term with those IPs, if they'd let FromSoftware just keep doing what they're doing, or if they run into challenges, suddenly the rug gets pulled out and Microsoft want them to throw in live service elements, all of that stuff. So I think it was worth mentioning because Microsoft had talked about it, and we know that they're just buying literally anything. If there's a developer that can get out a game that works, they seem to be interested, regardless of the quality. So From Software itself, where they go to from here, Shadow of the Erdtree releases, let's say it's great, let's say it's more of the same for the most part, and gamers love it, they get around Elden Ring as a title for a few more months, and then things simmer down. From Software to move on to their next titles. Are we going to see an Armored Core 7 after that? I feel like developing a sequel to Armored Core is going to be easier, take up less time than a brand new, full-fledged Elden Ring sequel, if that's what we're going to get next from, I guess you could call it the A-Team. It's a bit different with From Software, right? Because all their teams seem to release good products, except for maybe Dark Souls 2. So I feel a bit harsh calling it maybe A-Team or B-Team, but you get what I mean. Elden Ring is obviously the premium product, which they've acknowledged. They've said that Armored Core was never going to sell as much as Elden Ring did, which is fair. It's nice that they're realistic. Unlike Square Enix, who used to say that a title like Tomb Raider needed to sell, 30 million copies to break even, or at least to make investors happy. It was never going to, and now they're doing their own thing. There's a few disasters in their land. This may be a little unpopular these days, but I'd really like if From Software one day were to develop a Dark Souls 4, or if not, even a Bloodborne 2. It'd be really nice if we were to get that Bloodborne 1 port, but it seems like there's a rumour that does the rounds every couple of months, and then it doesn't happen, so I don't want to get my hopes up. I'll take a sequel. But if one of those games was to happen, I'd just like From Software to develop a linear title again someday, where it's all about those interconnected areas, one world, maybe less focus on fast traveling. I just really love those shortcuts and being able to kind of go anywhere and feel like it's a cohesive world in that way, and everywhere you go is interesting. It's a new location. Elden Ring's got some of that, but given it's quite open, there is, I suppose, a lot of those open areas where it's just mobs, there's not a lot happening. It's got its own strengths. I'm sure there's going to be an Elden Ring 2. It's going to do new things. But I'll be interested to see where From Software go. So thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you next time. Cheers.